Okay, so it may appear that nobody else is coming, so I think I should start. There is virtually nothing, I must apologize, there's virtually nothing we can do about the guy with the jackhammer down there who says he stopped for our lectures this morning and somebody said he could work over through the night or something like that. So unfortunately, I will just talk above the jackhammer as far as possible. Let's see, maybe this is even adjustable. Yeah, so thank you for staying till the very last graveyard shift session. I'm going to be talking about information retrieval and data mining for development, which is a, I'm going to just start off by saying that firstly, I'm Hussein Suleman from the University of Cape Town. This topic is it's a bit of a thread that runs through the 3 keynote talks that you will hear. So you heard one on Monday from Doug Ord, who spoke about multilingual issues, and I'm giving a bit of a general talk, and the 3rd keynote will be about very specific issues related to African languages. But if I want to give you a bit of a research question in some way, this is almost a founding question for the summer school. How can you use information retrieval, data mining, and similar techniques in order to support development in Africa? This is kind of the beginning point where we started off. And in some ways, it influences a lot of the research that we have done, that my group has done over many years. And I'm going to be talking about some of that research and see if we can somehow paint a picture around this. So we want to use information retrieval, data mining, and similar techniques. This is kind of an outline of the talk. Yes, it's not linear, but this is where we are going. So start right at the beginning. What is human or socioeconomic development? Now, lots of people have different ways of defining this. Many of you have heard of this notion of development. This is not software development, right? So this is things like the UN Millennium Development Goals. The United Nations loves to do things like this as an international organization, but there are also local organizations. So there's things like local governments that have different development plans, and I'll talk about some of these things, the ones that are highlighted. There are also regional development plans. And so what is this development? This is what we want to start off with as a discussion topic. So we've all seen this, right? The UN Millennium Development Goals. These were the UN's goals for things like eradicating extreme poverty, achieving universal primary education. A lot of people felt very passionately that these are the things we should put our energy into, as opposed to driverless cars and drone-delivered takeaway, right? So I have no interest in drone-delivered takeaway. Universal primary education is a more interesting topic, maybe. We've had this for a while, and people have thought that, okay, we need to expand this, and you've all seen this as well, I'm presuming. Make some presumptions here. The Sustainable Development Goals. So these development goals typically have periods of time when they're active, and the Sustainable Development Goals are the current goals from the UN, and it says that as a world, we want to achieve a few things that we would then call human development. We want to achieve no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, etc. There's a list of 17 of these. And these development goals, if you read all about them, you'll see that it's not just a nice picture. The nice picture is so people can put them on slides and things like that, make nice posters, banners, and whatever else. But there's also a lot of detail. And a lot of detail, plans, and metrics to evaluate how we have made progress or not made progress towards these goals, right? Soon you're going to be asking, why is this computer scientist talking about the United Nations for? We'll get there in time. What about other development plans? So in South Africa, we have a national development plan, a highly contested set of ideals that the government decided is what the country should work towards. creation of jobs, environmental sustainability, medical care, safety and security. It's a typical shopping list of the things that we think we should have if we want to call ourselves somewhat developed or developing. And I'm not going to get into the debate of whether there is such a thing as developed and what developing really means. But what about other countries? I mean, South Africa has a plan that in South Africa we know about. I wonder how many of you know about the development plans in your countries. So once I was giving a talk at Andy's institution, Andy was sitting at the back, some years back. And just before the talk, I checked to see, does the Austrian government have a development plan? And it did. And the subheadings look the same. So now this is an interesting question. If the South African development plan and the Austrian development plan all say the same things, right? This is more complex. You can't say one place has very good education, the other one doesn't, so it has it on its development plan. It's quite clear that everybody is developing, but maybe we're not all at the same place, right? What about other places? So I looked up a couple of other places. Nigeria, Vision 2020. Guess what? We are in 2020. Okay, a good question to ask yourself is, have we achieved Vision 2020 if you read the details of this particular plan? It's a very long plan. I don't know how many of you have read it. I read part of it. There's some people from Zambia. Are we on the 7th national plan? I believe it ends next year. The Zambians here. All sitting in one row. Are we achieving these goals, or are we making measurable progress? Right? So these are the things that we tend to ask as society, not necessarily as computer scientists. Something that affects a lot of people these days, especially in countries where we had colonization, is this notion of decolonization. In South Africa, this was a big discussion topic. How do we decolonize society? How do we somehow remove the evil effects? Because listen, all effects are not evil, but how do we remove the evil effects of colonization? Do we come up with different knowledge systems in order to remove the colonial legacy? I don't know. Do we do ICT differently? Is there an African computer? Do we need to invent programming languages in African languages? Do we need to teach programming in African languages? Do we need people who are public intellectuals? In other words, people who engage more with the public than people who try to be global scholars? And this is where that question of excellence versus local relevance comes in. And then there's a big question here. Why did most of the people who are teaching courses at AFIRM come from the Northern Hemisphere? Right? We were asked this question within the research community. What do key people within the community say about this? Right? How should we be approaching this notion of development, at the same time thinking about this notion of decolonization and finding our space within the world? So these are all questions you normally find in a social science talk, maybe not in a computer science talk. Or this is the cheap version of social science being spoken about by a computer scientist. The answer from computer science perspective often is something that we broadly call ICT for development. So can we as technology people somehow use the technology in order to meet the goals of development that I spoke about on the previous slides? And this is what lots of people obsess about. So where I work, I think about half of the staff would consider themselves to be people who work within the space of ICT for development. Somehow, the goal is always development. The goal is not making money. And this is a very difficult thing. It's not a clean split between the two, right? So we have to think a bit about that. So what are examples of this thing called ICT for D? If you've encountered this, typical examples relate to things like education. Can we use technology to make education better? This particular example is an electronic textbook, but not just any electronic textbook. It's an electronic textbook that's distributed as an open source version that you can then remix and reuse in different ways and adapt to your classroom. So you get the textbook in some kind of encoded text form that you can then adapt, which hopefully will open itself up to innovation. We think this might have some impact on education. We don't know. What's another example? medical care. So on the left-hand side, there's an example of some kind of vaccination record. My mom has one of these. So I'm shocked she still has it. From when I was born, she kept it, and she still has it. The first time I had to leave the country, the place I was going to asked for my immunization or vaccination records. And I was just saying, there is no way we have this, and she brings it out, right? So moms are really good at keeping records. But what else can we do? Well, these days we think maybe we can do this electronically. If we can we use technology? The question that we have to ask is, can we use technology to somehow make medical care better in various different ways? And maybe one very simple way is by not losing people's medical records, by actually keeping them safe, exchanging them among doctors that you go to. And this is something that lots of people are thinking about actively, not just in African countries, but all over the world. This is a really dated picture, but some people have argued, and this is a big argument, right, that we can use technology as a way of organizing communities so that they can improve the state of their countries, they can rise up against tyranny in their countries. So if there's a need for a revolution somewhere, you're going to organize the revolution over Twitter, right? So I've heard people say the revolution will be on Twitter. Of course, then there were those who said the revolution will not be on Twitter. But can we use technology to bring about a better society in a very direct way? This is a question, right? These are all questions. Can we give one laptop to every child? This is a wonderful picture. I can't remember which country this was from. This was the One Laptop Per Child project, which said, you give a laptop to every child, and you will improve education, right? And numerous articles have been written about how this was a complete and absolute failure for all kinds of reasons. But it was an idea, right? It was an idea worth testing. Can we change education radically by giving every child some kind of laptop? And so this is what ICT4D people obsess over. Can we use ICT to aid human development? And what I specifically want to ask is, can we use information retrieval and data mining to aid human development? Right? I don't build laptops, but I deal with data. And can we use the data in some way? So when we try to do this, it turns out that there are lots of very, very serious challenges. And so I've tried to summarize these before I talk about some of the interventions that we have attempted to implement. In all of the challenges, I think my goal is often in many of these things to ask the question, how can we use information retrieval and similar techniques to deal with human development, but specifically looking at aspects of human dignity? Now, this is one of those questions that often, for computer scientists, we don't have the discussions about this at the way that the social scientists may discuss this. But under the category of human dignity, there are lots of subcategories and things that I think are rather interesting. Promoting the status of local languages. There are lots of people who say that we really need content in our local languages. So the question I have is, can we build systems to support the creation of content in all those local languages? How do you increase the presence of local languages? And there's a number of other things under human dignity. The second major topic that I want to ask you about is, how can we directly use information retrieval to directly address development problems? And this is really, really hard, but we'll talk a bit more about this. So what are the challenges facing us? Well, the first thing you quickly ask is, or you quickly discover is, actually, many of these algorithms that should exist may not necessarily exist. Now, linking back to Doug's talk on Monday, Doug said, well, this is all easy stuff, right? So how much do you need to do that's different, right? What if you want to do natural language processing? That's a talk that I'm going to leave to Maria Keat. So I'll give you a teaser. She's going to talk about some of those things. But what about, do you have every little piece of the puzzle that you need to do information retrieval. And this is what we have to wonder about. Sometimes you may not. And sometimes we need to put in some effort to invent this. Are there language-specific tools, algorithms in African languages? How well do they work? This is, I think, one of the challenges we have to deal with. The second challenge is data. How much data is out there? Well, I normally ask people to look at the bottom of the page on Wikipedia. What are the languages with the fewest number of pages? And it turns out that a lot of those are African languages. So I look at this, Tswana number 264, Tsonga number 271, Sesotho number 273, Xhosa number 260. These are all South African national languages. And they would appear further down on the list than many of the languages. English will be right at the top, but many of the African languages are at the bottom. So this means we don't have a lot of content. You may think, okay, the content is not on Wikipedia. In many cases, the content is nowhere. It does not exist, right? And it's very difficult to start thinking about how we build data-intensive systems if you don't actually have the content. So we don't have the content online, we don't have the corpus, and this is one of the challenges that we face when we try to do this work. What about fuzziness? This is my fuzzy title for this. It's unclear what is a language, what is a dialect, where is the boundary between two languages, right? So how do you know that you have content in one language but you don't have it in the other one? Because it's not really as clearly defined as it may be for certain languages in the world. So we have to deal with this notion of fuzziness in trying to do any kind of processing of text or speech or anything like that. Then there's the digital divide, right? This is a well-discussed concept. From our perspective, we ask things like, how many people understand how to search? Do people actually understand how to search? What if we give them a search interface on a mobile device? Will everybody know how to do this? How is this related to literacy and digital literacy? So these are things that we have to ask. I think Doug already spoke about internet access and turned the lights off when he was giving his talk so we could all see that, in fact, we don't have as much as we think. Then there's the notion of multilingualism. So one of the first things you might have encountered is in South Africa, if you meet a lot of South Africans, you'll find out that the average South African speaks, I think it's 4 languages, 3 to 4. Of course, I know lots of students who will claim to be fluent in 5 or 6. Now, this is normal for many people. Multilingualism is normal. In order to survive in a multicultural society, you need to be able to converse in multiple languages. But what does that mean for digital data? Does that not mean that your tweets are going to have multiple languages in them? Any document you write is going to be some weird combination of multiple languages. Have any of you ever watched a South African TV series? Some, right? If you ever something you may not know, so those of you who haven't, we don't export a lot of our TV series. Because if you don't understand English and Afrikaans really well and have a pretty good vocabulary in a number of other languages, you don't know what they're talking about, right? So this makes life a bit tricky. So that's another challenge. And the last challenge that I want to focus quite a bit on in my talk is resource limits. We don't have resources, right? We may have gold in the ground. That gold goes somewhere else. The people of the country don't have the resources, right? So we don't have skilled researchers. This is one of the reasons for AFIRM, right? We don't have lots of bandwidth to access data. And this is a universal problem. Bandwidth may seem like it's really great until you go to another country and you find out they have 100 times more bandwidth than you have here, right? We don't have a lot of skilled users, and basically we don't have money, right? So these resource limitations are a very serious thing. So how do you deal with all of these things if you're trying to do research in information retrieval and data mining and related areas, and your goal is human development? So I want to talk about some of the studies we've done, and I'm going to spend some time talking about the last thing that I did probably in the last 6 months or so. So none of you would have heard that before. Start off with first questions. You know, we can ask some of these things, we can do these things fairly scientifically, and we can test ideas that have been proven elsewhere. So one thing I did, which I actually presented 2 months ago, can we detect in the language of a document very quickly with a simple algorithm? And I'm a big believer in simplicity here. Can we use a simple algorithm to detect which one of the 9 South African languages a document is written in, given that there's actually a lot of overlap among the different languages? And we did a study. We used an algorithm that was used for some European languages, used some data that we could find, and we found that actually this is not a really difficult problem to solve. We can actually differentiate among languages really easily, and in some cases, I think we got something like 80% accuracy. This doesn't say it's on slide. We got about 80% accuracy differentiating the language of a tweet. So we just needed 140 characters and we could figure out what the language was. So this is like almost the first step if you're trying to grab content from the web and figure out what language it is in. In trying to build collections, we also thought, okay, crowdsourcing, and there's a crowdsourcing talk tomorrow, right? Where is it? It's not here. It's on the other side, and there's our speakers up there. They'll tell you all about crowdsourcing. We found it doesn't work at all. Everybody in the world was saying, crowdsourcing, you can build your collections using crowdsourcing. And so we did an elaborate experiment. We used lots of different variations of payment. We tried to pay people. We tried to game the system. Like, for example, we get people to contribute, and then we start decreasing the amount we pay them. Or we keep paying them the same amount of money, but we increase the amount of work. Right? We try to figure out, what is driving people to contribute this content. And what we found was it was just the money. Right? They didn't care so much about how we game this. The moment we tried the one where you stop the money, see what happens, restart the money. Right? And money was the only criteria. As long as there was money, people would contribute. So this was actually the opposite of what many studies from the rest of the world said. And this is a bit of a theme through a lot of the experiments we have done. So we also tried to, this notion of gaming, a lot of people these days believe, well, we can gamify anything. Gamification is a great thing. So we are currently doing an experiment where we've created some kind of portal where people can contribute documents. And we're asking this question, this is not yet finished, but we're asking this question about, can we gamify the submission of content? So we're trying to build a super collection of lots of African language content. If we make this into a game in every way possible, will we get more content, or are people going to lose interest? Is there actually intrinsic motivation to contribute content? I'm actually a bit pessimistic about this, right? The expected result, I'm expecting the result to be no. That actually people are not going to contribute just because it seems like the right thing to do, right? So this is something to think about very seriously. I want to talk a little about African language information retrieval. I'm going to give you a summary version because this is more something that Maria Keith will talk about. Well, not information retrieval, but things related to African languages. 2 things we found. We've built a number of information retrieval systems with content in different African languages. The first big study we did was done by Mohammed Mustafa Ali, where he was looking at how a search engine like Google treats mixed language queries. So if you have a query where you have part of the query in one language and the other part of the query in another language, it turns out the commercial search engines don't really think about this too much. And the difference in importance of the different languages in terms of document collections has a distinct impact on the results that you get. The results will be skewed so that you don't necessarily get the most relevant results. So if you're somebody who issues a complex query in multiple languages, you're going to get worse results. Your best bet currently is to issue your query in one language until search engines actually catch on and decide that they can re-rank the results in a different way. Right? So all this has been published, but I don't think any of this has been incorporated into the commercial search engines. Something else that we looked at, was search engines in what are known as the Bantu languages. And these are many of the languages that are spoken in South Africa. And we want to know, can this be done? What is the barrier here, right? Besides the fact that we don't have the content, we don't have the resources. can we do this at an algorithmic level? And it works relatively well. We can build many of these systems using the basic algorithms that people have been talking about at the summer school, but there's some things that you have to do. You have to figure out the language identification. That's where I started. You need to do text pre-processing that is specific to the language. And this is hard, and I'm thinking you're going to talk a bit about this, right? So I'm saving that for Maria. But you have to think about ranking and re-ranking, right? So it's not good enough to just get the results. Maybe you need to make adjustments because of the nature of the languages. And this is what we are finding in many experiments works quite well. But I'm going to stop there talking about the African languages. I want to talk about specific development interventions. So this is really hard. If I had to get all of you together and ask you point blank, how do you use data mining for development, right? There's no natural, simple answer to this. So what are we most passionate about in terms of development? Well, the one we tried first was unemployment. How are you going to use information retrieval for unemployment? So we spent a lot of time in this study, which unfortunately is paused because my student has gone away for a while. We spent a lot of time trying to understand the users. So, who's the unemployed, right? We are trying to understand the unemployed people. What do they actually want? And we did a bit of a study, did some surveys, some interviews, and what they told us actually was that they wanted directed, organized information. So when they want to look for a job, they want something, they don't want a list of search results in the traditional way. They want to know, they want these in a way that they can compare this. So they want a lot more processing. And these are people who are not necessarily highly literate. And maybe the solution for them is not that classical search engine result page, right? And so we've been fiddling around with that idea. We need to have relevance, to think of relevance slightly differently, not just in terms of the search engine result page. Another kind of ongoing study here that we're doing, we wanted to know, and I saw some people had posters about Twitter, so we want to know, can we exploit Twitter data for development, right? So for some years, we had machines just sitting there collecting Twitter data. And then we want to know, now what, right? What can we do with this Twitter data? So I'm not sure how much we can do with it, but we wanted to know, can we measure attributes of society? And this is hard. I wanted to know how democratic a society is. Because, and I don't know how many of you follow this, but there are organizations like the Mo Ibrahim Foundation that do studies that take an entire year to measure the level of freedom of expression in different African countries. Once a year, they publish a long report. This is the state of the continent. Has anybody read this? No? No? Okay, you must look for this, right? This is really cool. They will actually tell you this place is getting better in terms of freedom of expression. This one here, it's becoming a bit more repressive, right? It takes them an entire year to come up with this report, one single report, and then they turn around and they start again for the next year. Now I want to know, can we just suck that data off Twitter and give you the same analysis in a matter of minutes? Because we've been collecting the data of Twitter. And our initial study was quite fascinating because we found that we could do graph analysis. We could do graph mining, essentially, and use the characteristics of the graph, and this correlated with some aspects of what people were doing on Twitter. We didn't actually have to look at the content. All we had to do was watch the changing structure at a significantly large scale, and we could determine what was happening in society, right? So this is something I think that's worth investigating. But these are really, really specific and difficult things. So after having thought a lot about this, and these seem like really difficult problems, I got yanked back last year into an old research area of mine, which was asking, how do we deal with basic information retrieval, but without the resources, right? And part of the reason for this is we noticed that some of the things that we were doing were not necessarily giving us the results we really wanted. So this was one of the early experiments. We tried a speech user interface. So Doug was talking about speech, I think, right? So if you're talking about speech data, you can get a lot of speech data relatively easily. Doug keeps telling me we should set up a microphone to just listen to the television all the time and we'll get lots of data. So we built a full interface that was speech-driven for doing search. And then we did experiments with users. And what did they say? Yeah, it works, but we don't want it, right? That we actually want the version that is in English rather than the version that is in Xhosa, which is what we had done this in. So this is a bit of a strange result. So we're thinking about these low resources. How do you deal with low resource environments? Well, another project that I had looked at how we build a dictionary for a language that we couldn't encode on computer. So there's one of the ancient languages in this part of the world that after much fiddling around, we learned can't be represented in Unicode because Unicode only represents languages that were invented in the last 100 years or that were popular in the last 100 years. So if your language, if the language has not been used for 150 years, they didn't include it when they were thinking about Unicode. I don't know if you know this. So we're not the only ones. There's other countries in the world where their ancient languages are not representable in Unicode. It has to be a language that has not been used in the last 100 years. So we have one of these. And so we tried to do search by image, where essentially, if you're trying to search for a word, you draw a box around the word, and then it will search through the whole collection and find all of the similar boxes. So this is an image matching kind of problem. And, you know, it kind of works. We got some small accuracy here, but not good enough to write home about. Something else that we tried to do, we said, okay, so if the search accuracy is not that good, we don't have resources for this language. We're not going to get an army of people to sit down and transcribe the documents, right? So these documents are written in this older language, Palm or Zam, or however you pronounce it. Where are the Namibians? They're not here. If you can't find lots of people to write the text down, and we have 20,000 pages of stories written in this language, and it represents the oldest history of South Africa, and if the visual search is not working, can we convert the images of the text into machine processable text? So we did the obvious thing, machine learning to transcribe. Right, this is a long time ago. Machine learning to transcribe seemed like it was the best technique available, and we got 45% accuracy, and the crowdsourcing people will be happy to know. We switched to crowdsourcing, and we got better accuracy from complete amateurs, right? We got 10% better performance with complete amateurs trying to transcribe this. But it's still a problem that 55% accuracy of transcription, now you layer on a search interface there. This doesn't look like it's working very well. We need to think more about some of these problems. So I went back after a while and asked, okay, these problems are an ongoing thing, right? We're working on the algorithms. We're trying to give people interfaces to find the data, even though the data is really hard to work with. We don't have transcriptions. We don't have the money to create transcriptions that are of high enough quality, and we don't have the skilled people who are able to deal with some of this. And in the middle of doing all of this, the most unusual thing started to happen, okay, so I'm going to come back to the unusual thing. But the most unusual thing happened. We were affected immediately by the fact that we have this low resource environment. And we wanted to have these archives. The archives were going to store heritage collections, and I was busy trying to build search interfaces. But I was in a low resource environment. And the impact of this low resource environment, I'll come to in a second. First, let's define what we mean. What's a low resource environment? Well, you may think it's a poor country, right? As I've been convinced by some people, It could be a poor region in a rich country. So every country has some low resource environments, not just a poor country. And some scenarios in a rich region in a rich country, right? So my examples are in the bottom. Malawi is a poor country, period. Somebody here is from Malawi. Malawi is what I would consider to be a poor country. I don't believe in developing and all of that nonsense. If you look at the UN definitions, I think they say you must stop using these words. So anybody calls anything a developing country, those are the old days. Rural Scotland, I had somebody once in a presentation tell me that rural Scotland was just like rural South Africa. They had poor internet connectivity, no resources, and basically they needed the same solutions we needed. If you want to create a family album online, and you're a rich person living in New York City, I don't know if everybody in New York City is rich, obviously not, right? But do you not have the same problem? Because you may not have you may have money, some money, you may not have the skills, right? So there's different types of resources that are not available. So you want to think about this very carefully. What happens if you don't have resources? So this is the thing that really got to me. This is a slide from my lecture notes from many years ago. And it was about one of the most incredible archives in the country when I arrived in Cape Town many years ago, called the South African Freedom Struggles. And we had, democracy is, what, 25 years old? Democracy is a new thing here. And the liberation movement had all kinds of publications. So we thought it would be great to create an archive of all the publications of the liberation movement so that people could study this intensely and they could use this to understand how to bring about change in countries and things like that, how to bring about peaceful revolutions around the world. We all thought this was very important. And with lots of donor funding from around the world, people scanned every single magazine, article, newspaper related to the liberation struggle. It's gone, right? This archive no longer exists. The URL simply doesn't work. There's no redirection. Apparently somebody in the US has a copy, and that's the only way you can get to it, right? So what happened? What happened essentially is they ran out of money. The project funder stopped funding the project, and I'm not sure if the server crashed. All the staff left the project, and that was it, right? So this really, really bothered me, because these are important documents about a poor country, and we put the effort into creating this, but now it's just all gone, right? So I have to ask, what do we do about this? How do we somehow deal with this? How do you build a low-resource archive? This is the question that I spent a lot of time thinking about here. I had a German colleague. Hope none of you are German. Well, none of you are that particular colleague anyway, right? I had a German colleague who, in a conference in India once, when I said, building these archives and collections is not that easy, he piped up from the back of the room, if you give me 2 million euros and 2 years, I will build you any digital repository system. Well, not in exactly those words, right? But, and that was kind of the end of the conversation, because nobody had 2 million euros to give this guy. So clearly we needed to look for another solution, because this was simply not going to work, right? And we can't be just throwing money at the problem, because maybe somebody in Germany has the money to throw at the problem like this. We don't have the money here. There are lots of places in the world, especially many places in Africa, where people simply don't have the money. You can't use money as the way to get yourself out of the way of creating archives of important stuff. So then the question is, do we simply do what everybody else is doing? Well, if everybody else is using the 2 million euro solution, then the answer is no. What we need to do is we need to figure out, are there alternative solutions? Is there a way of doing this that doesn't require as much resources, that will actually, where we can build solutions that work in low resource environments? So there were a couple of things that I've done, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and some of my ex-students have spent time building prototypes to test basic ideas. And we want to know, can we actually come up with principles, firstly, for how we should go about doing this? Is there a universal framework guideline for how we go about doing this? Is there some kind of theoretical model for this? And you will be happy to know I'm not talking about the theoretical model today. If you want to, there are papers about all of this. But what I want to talk about is some practical examples. So the first thing that we asked is, do you absolutely need to have a database? Now, I remember when I was a student arguing with people that starting off with a database was a natural starting point, right? You had a collection of data, put it into a database. I made that argument myself, I'll admit to it. Now I'm going to say that was the wrong argument, right? If you have a collection of data, the question to ask yourself is, what is the best way of representing the data to meet the objectives that you have? And if your objectives are, in fact, to preserve an important collection of data for as long as possible, I don't think a database is the best solution. I think actually having your data in as flat a form as possible is a much better solution. So we've built a number of systems around this principle that actually all data gets stored as XML files. Now, there's nothing special about XML. We can use JSON. I know some people have this great JSON versus XML debate. It's irrelevant. We can add an XML to JSON translator easily, right? But store all of your data in some structured format as a file, something that a human can edit, something that doesn't require a system to mediate. Why mediate access to things that where there is no need for mediation? And then we can transform this into whatever we want to. So that's the first thing that I think is an interesting implementation of one of those principles. The second approach that I've toyed with for a long time is, why do we need to have a web server? Can we not do away with the web server? I read an interesting article last week about serverless computing. This is not that, right? Serverless computing is apparently about using this thing called the cloud. We don't need the cloud either, right? Do we actually need all of this stuff? Well, if you look at the browsers that you're using today, the browser has so much capability built into it. Can we not exploit what you have right there on your desktop to do a lot of the processing? So whereas in the past we had data, service components, user interface components, all on the server, can't we push this out, right? And people have all kinds of fancy names for this. Can't we push this out so that more of it is closer to the user? Because if we do that, we reduce the requirements for these external components. We don't have that server. And that means that if you are in a place where the internet is not reliable, you are not relying on the internet to make happen what you want to make happen, right? For this summer school, we told all the instructors, send your stuff to us so we keep them closer to the users, because we're not sure the internet's going to work on the day when you need to do your lab session, right? And you know, maybe it works here a little better than other places, but it's always something to think about. The third part of the solution is, do you really need all of those fancy online systems? Can you change the online systems so they're not online? So as an example, if you have any kind of online system where somebody is able to add comments to anything, right? What do you do with those comments? Every time, now I can almost guarantee you, almost every system you see out there, when you want to see a view of the page, it picks the comments out of a database and it creates a viewable page for you. Now, every time you want to view that page, it picks stuff out of the database. Why? Can't you just pick it out of the database once? In fact, why even put it into a database? Why don't you just put it there in the first place where it should be, right? So it turns out this is not very difficult to implement in practice, but you have to stop and you have to ask yourself, why are you architecting the system the way that you are? Well, because somebody somewhere decided that there was a universal architecture for all of these content-based systems. And I'm arguing maybe there is no such thing as a universal architecture. Maybe if we're thinking of low-resource environments, we need to come back and rethink what the architecture is supposed to be. So I spent a lot of my time last year building a prototype system, and I'm not going to show you the whole prototype system. This is just the beginning. There's some kind of search here. And just one thing I'm going to point out here was I built a search and faceted search engine that lives completely within your browser. So it doesn't actually use any server-side components. We can run the entire system offline, and it gives you the experience of typical information retrieval, but without involving anything else. And the big question that we often have to ask with many information retrieval systems is, how fast is this? We know we can get the accurate results, but how quickly can we get the results? So I spent a lot of time actually doing measurements, because you have to convince people this works. And it turns out that when we had something like 30,000 items in the collection, and I think this graph actually shows 32,000 items here and various complexities of queries. We looked at a few facets combined with various different types of queries, popular queries, query terms that were not that popular, typical queries that people might construct. And in all of these instances, actually, I think the graph stops at 300. That's 300 milliseconds. So no user is going to notice that this is actually not running on any server, right? And now you can ask the other question, who has 32,000 items in their collection? Well, I can tell you for a fact that many universities don't have more than 32,000 items in their institutional repositories, in their ETD collections. There are various heritage collections that don't have a lot of items. In fact, in less than 1 second, we can probably search through 100,000 items. So we can meet the needs, and this is not a very fancy solution, incidentally. We can meet the needs of lots of people with lots of collections of a reasonable size with a fairly simple solution that doesn't have very high requirements, right? And this is the takeaway message here. This is possible. We don't need to, and this is going to be the opposite of what people are told. Where is Charlie? This is going to be the opposite of what people tell you when you talk about IR, right? That there are standard toolkits out there, and you can use them. Well, they probably don't run in your browser, but we can get away with a lot of solutions to lots of problems without having to use the fairly advanced toolkits, right? So this is still something that's ongoing, but this is all the last example I want to throw up there for you. What I want to ask is, so where are we now? Right, after thinking of all of this, where are we now? Are we dealing with the problems of low-resource environments? Are we dealing with how to build solutions that are going to address our needs when we start thinking about development? Some final thoughts here. Where we are? Well, these are some early successes. But we still really haven't completely dealt with this issue of many languages. This is still an open thing out there. A lot of people still seem to think, okay, we build a corpus in one language and then we go from there. I'm not sure it always works. We haven't yet tackled this issue of having few documents. The resources are always going to be a question mark. And the way in which people communicate and how they communicate is actually not the same all over the world, contrary to what anybody may believe. So lots of work is still needed. There's still lots of opportunity for research in these areas. There's lots still out there. What should we do? I think we need to think differently about data, right? I'm not saying we as in people in this room here. I think the entire research community needs to think differently about this. There is not one solution, firstly, and most definitely there is not one solution developed somewhere in a high-resource environment that can then be used everywhere in the world, right? There's probably a group of different solutions to different problems, and we need to think about all these things. We need to think differently in some instances about information retrieval and data mining. Some of these things are universal. Indexing, maybe. Haven't found any great reasons to change how we do indexing. Some things are not universal, right? We're not all online all the time. I sent email to one of my students yesterday. I won't tell you which one. You see here. And then I found out that he was completely offline, right? And so, right, we are not all online all the time. Unicode does not solve all our problems, right? So sometimes we have to think about interesting solutions to all of these. We may need to invent completely new solutions. And I think we really need to keep in mind that we are not trying to change where we live. We're not trying to change Africa as much as we are trying to change the world. Because if you invent a better solution for a problem here, a solution that uses few resources but works here. I mean, I was in Norway. I was in Norway of all places at the end of last year, and I presented a talk on something related to this. And all my colleagues at the conference said, "Yeah, if you do this, we are all going to use this too, right?" And Norway is a rich country by most people's understanding, because if you build a solution that uses fewer resources, everybody is going to be interested. Right? It's not just going to be to benefit people who have few resources, but people who have all kinds of different resources. And my last slide here is, why AFIRM, right? So this is my plug for to connect us to the events that come after this. Why are we here? Given all of the things that I just said, how does all of this link to all of you coming here for AFIRM? Well, if we want to achieve this goal of development in this low-resource environment, we need to start to think about how we can somehow boost research in this field within Africa. And so as a prime objective of AFIRM, we want to boost research. We need to somehow reconnect people with the international community. So the whole idea of AFIRM came up because there was a conference where there was a discussion, and they realized nobody from the African continent was at this conference, right? So somehow, somewhere along the line, the thread has been broken, and we need to reconnect this. And the third thing I thought is, as a reason why we are running this summer school is we really want to create a new community here. It's not just that African researchers are disconnected from the international community, we are disconnected from one another. And if you go to other parts of the world, you'll find there are lots of community-based activities, and we are just not doing that enough. So we need to start thinking about all these things to ponder. I'm going to leave these as open questions here, because these are going to come up during the course of the rest of this week. Where is AFIRM 2021 going to be? It's not going to be here, right? So who is going to be the host for AFIRM 2021? Where should we go next as a group? How can we improve what we are doing? I mean, the difficulty about running AFIRM for 2 years running is that, gosh, last year we thought we did it so well that we just did it the same way this year. Well, okay, not really, but we haven't been as innovative as we could be because it's the same venue. What else should we do as a community besides AFIRM? I'll give you the one obvious answer. We have a mailing list. You will all get added to the mailing list. But what else should we do? All right? So this is something we should think about. And the last question is, for some of you who have been listening to some of the talks, you would have picked up that in other parts of the world, there have been common challenges set as a way to somehow focus the research that people have been doing. Right? There have been evaluation tasks, and should we think about some kind of common challenge as the basis for research going into the future, in the near future, in the immediate future, right? Should we have some kind of common challenge? And then the second question is going to be, what is that common challenge going to be, right? So these are all questions I would like people to think about, because these are questions we would really, really like your feedback on as we go through the rest of the week, because it will help us to figure out where we go to next as a community. Right? So with that, thank you very much. I'm happy to field questions if people have any. There's one down here. Sure.
So the problem of having solutions for sort of the most common set of entities, and then really working hard to find solutions for the rare ones, is not the first one. With rare languages, there have been similar kinds of history with rare diseases, and using genomic and computational biology approaches for finding first the most common one and challenging, and then the rare diseases started coming up, and people, and then sort of even expanding it for genomes that are on the. A lot of the data sets are assembled. The best data sets for disease and genomic studies are from Iceland and Japan, right? So clearly does not apply to Africa. An African genome. And people have developed approaches that leverage the information from the common ones to the rare ones, and the variety of other information as well. What can we learn perhaps from the journey of those domains that can apply in this?
Right, so the question was about what can we learn from those who have solve some of these problems in other circumstances, especially with larger data sets. I'm just paraphrasing a bit here. And we've actually done some of those. I deleted some of those slides because I had way too many when I started off this morning. Some of the search engine experiments we've done have been essentially transfer learning experiments. So we've tried to do things like build search engines for the most popular languages and see if we can then use some kind of adaptation to use the same model that we learned in the first place for some language that's not as popular. And that seems to work somewhat. I'm not convinced how well it works, but it does. But I mean, transfer learning is something that everybody would suggest as the first thing to try for some of these cases, and there is some success. I don't know beyond that. I mean, the genomics thing is interesting. I was immediately thinking how we could use their approach directly in addressing some of this, but we should talk. Yes?
So, to the big theme, how can modern computing technology assist in development? I think we need to look beyond text and information retrieval, and particularly, I think mobility data is a goldmine because it allows you to understand, for the first time in the history of humanity, how a society actually behaves and works at a level that was unprecedented. And I think it's universal. That the saturation with mobile phones, not necessarily smartphones, is incredible globally. So this is something I think to look at and think about. There have been some interesting initiatives in that area some years ago, but I think that's where you can actually at least point to evidence of something happening and needing to be addressed. And there's no discussion because you say, well, that's where people go and that's where they go from there that time of the day. So I think this is a kind of data that's very promising.
Okay. So the comment was about possibly using mobility data, which we'll have to think about. I have no response to this.
No.
I think it's an interesting thing to look at. I can say I do know that some people can get the data more easily than others. In some countries, we've asked, and they've said no, yeah. Absolutely not. And what I'm always worried about is the countries where somebody's willing to just give you this stuff, because I'm not sure they should be giving it to you, but we have tried some of this. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions. One, is technology the solutions of Africa's problems? And then the second one, how do we apply indigenous knowledge to scientific research?
Okay, so these are hard questions. We'll be here all night. The first one is technology the solution to all our problems? The second one is how do we use indigenous knowledge in science? I don't have the authority to answer either one of those things. Is technology the solution to all our problems? Well, if you ask me this question, I'm still looking for the answer to this. Let me give you the complicated answer here, which says, as a computer scientist, to complicate the question. Sure.
So that we can leave here, because I might have to ask my own after you, so that you can just.
Sure.
I asked that question yesterday when Andre when he presented. The reason I want to ask it again, he's not here now. I want to hear your perspective, but you were not here when I asked that question. Okay, and then when you come from a place where you have heard something over again, and you come to a place like this and you hear that they are saying something close to it and not that, I think it's necessary before you leave, you get some level of clearance so that when you go back, maybe you can either continue to believe what you have heard or you will start to believe in the system. Yeah, and I think that's why we are here for our friend and all that. The question is, I think people like what she has said, can we use technology to solve social problems? Because going by the goals, development goals, South Africa, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, that you showed, a lot of social problems there. First, can we use? If it is yes, okay, how? I want to know your thoughts about that. If it is no, why? If we know, because we have been told something, it will be something different from using technology to solve social problems.
Right. So these are the hard problems, right? The hard questions we are coming to now. Can we use technology to address social problems? I don't know what the answer is, but I can tell you, as somebody who does experiments with technology, I would rather experiment with technology to find the answer to that question than to find any other answer. I would prefer to do experiments to see if we can somehow improve society rather than make somebody rich. When I find the answer, I don't know, maybe we can work together to find if there are answers to this. But I think there are some promising avenues, right? The promising avenues are things like research and education. So can we use technology to make information accessible to people? And you'd have to stop and ask yourself, is making information accessible enough? Can we somehow help the education process? And so most of what I do is about research and education. It's about creating collections of information that people can use to do research, to learn from. Because I think that has got to be part of the solution. I'm not convinced about lots of the other technology interventions. I still think building water pipes and giving people electricity is probably it's secondary after medicine, food, right? But those are things that are very difficult for us to do with technology. But education, research, giving people the means to find the solutions to other problems is something I think we can do, right? So I'm going to talk about indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems, I think, I'm not so sure how this works with the scientific process. A lot of people seem to think that there's a different way of doing knowledge. But I think our ideas, so I don't know how many of you think about this, but ideas about knowledge that may be different in Africa often need to interface with ideas of knowledge from all over the world to produce a composite with various different ideas. I don't think there's one, you're not going to replace one system with another system. That I think is not the way to go. And this is what everybody says about this, and I agree with this perspective. So I don't think that we don't want an African knowledge system. What we want is the best of knowledge systems from everywhere together. We want to contribute to some kind of universal thing, right? Because I think at that level, it's basically about the best principles that society as a whole has come up with. Right? Any other final questions, thoughts?
Maybe thoughts.
Thoughts, yeah.
During your presentation, it was very clear that one of the goals of AFIRM is to help, give skills to researchers in Africa and see how they can help solve the problem in Africa and all that. I'm thinking that here in South Africa, it's a little bit easy. You got exposure outside South Africa and all that, and you're able to come back to, start helping to build your skills, to train people and all that. Back in Nigeria, that is a lot of frustration for some people who decide to come back and to live here. A lot of frustration. And even when some people, out of their own personal effort, get the opportunity to go out, because of what they are living, it's difficult to come back with those skills. Maybe with information retrieval, we could start thinking about political solutions. I don't know how we push that, because I still feel that the more we empower ourselves as Africans with skills, in some African countries, some of the people with those skills will probably not stay. We have to put in place where their skills will be respected, where their skills will find more value and all that. Because the average African ruler, I don't call them leaders, don't just want to put their hand to work. They don't just want to work. They just want to be. I don't know how to describe it. Yes, we cannot pretend anymore. We are pretending too much. We pretend too much. We are not ready to do anything. You see, the average African person, when he leaves the shore of Africa, all right, I've seen people who are not as educated as myself, but because they were able to leave the shore, they are far better. They go there and you see them, it's like they have been sleeping and they wake up and they are doing things and it's working for them. So maybe a political solution. I don't know how those of us in the academia can actually champion that. That's the thinking that I want to, thoughts that I think I want to leave with also that we can start thinking, because it can be part of how we can contribute to development in Africa. Because if you develop 2-3 people and they are frustrated and they leave, it's like you have not done nothing. It's like we are back to where we find ourselves.
So that's a very good point to stop, because the notion of the frustration of an academic who goes back to their country is part of the topic for the late night discussion we are having at 9 in the seminar room in All Africa House. Anybody wants to come, you can join us there. It will be very informal, and that is very much the topic of the discussion. So thank you.